Led by advancements and optimism in AI, the tech sector rebounding last year following a really tough 2022. So what should investors be watching out for from big tech in 2024? Joining us now, Dan Morgan, Synovus Trust Senior Portfolio Manager, with his top themes for the new year. First of all, Dan, Happy New Year. Thanks for being here with us. Yep. Appreciate it. So I know you're looking ahead to themes for the new year. And I do want to start in AI here, and in particular, what is sort of next for AI. And I know you're looking at the sort of server business in particular. We saw some of that last year, notably with NVIDIA, right, for chips to power servers to train AI. What's sort of the next leg of that?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, Julie, because I'm in the camp that really I look at AI as kind of across-the-board productivity enhancement, opposed to a mega trend like we saw back in the 1990s. We had the movement towards the internet, the big CapEx build on that. We had the big move towards mobile phones. We had the year 2000 software bug, and you had a lot of money being spent to kind of go and, create that. And AI, we've talked before, Julie, on the show about how at a lot of times we have trouble really finding specific evidence where AI is actually creating a major increase in profits other than in the chip companies. So, I look at it more as an optimization, productivity enhancement situation. I don't see, some sort of huge, massive spend that's going to come out and we're going to see, profits doubling on certain quarters of certain tech companies. I see it kind of sprinkling across the board. So right now, the only evidence we have is really in chips. And you mentioned NVIDIA, and there's a few others that have shown profit reports that have actually increased from it, but it's really sparse beyond that.
And Dan, for viewers who are listening too, and maybe they're invested in AI-focused companies, any concern you had about the New York Times, launching that lawsuit against Microsoft and OpenAI? Is that a risk that investors need to consider? Because I would assume, Dan, there could very well be more lawsuits like that coming.
Yeah, Josh, that's a risk. Obviously, China's a big risk too, right? We constantly have China with these, pulling certain products that they're allowed to come on. That's been really evidenced in the chip sector. But, anytime you have regulators coming in and, starting to dig into it, that was kind of the first headline company you mentioned, Microsoft. You gotta remember, Meta's in that, Alphabet's in that. There's just all the big stocks, technology, have huge AI initiatives, and you start to get more regulatory oversight. That could be an issue going forward in terms of the speed of this rollout and how it can positively impact these companies. Josh, you mentioned Microsoft. Microsoft's a company that we really haven't seen any evidence of a major pickup in profits directly related to AI.
And Dan, you did mention China there, and that's, another big theme. And so I'm interested to get your take on that, Dan. Obviously a lot of American tech companies, Western tech companies, they used to, they looked at China, Dan, as this really important end market. Do you think that's going to still be true in 2024 and beyond, even as the Chinese economy is clearly shaky here and you have these rising geopolitical tensions between Washington and Beijing? Do you think how Western tech companies think about China, is that evolving and changing, Dan?
Well, Josh, you bring up a good point. I would expect them to continue to try to work around these regulations. You look at like NVIDIA, they have two key chips. They have the H100 and the A100. Well, they have two other chips that they produce that are very similar to those that they sell in the China market. So obviously these companies, in America do a tremendous amount of business there. Qualcomm does 60% of their total revenues are out of that region. Micron does about 15, just give you some numbers. So I don't think we can just turn the page on China. I think last quarter, if we looked at Apple, they did about 15 to 20% of revenues out of China. So I still think it's a huge growth area. Let's face it, it's 1 billion people. You can't just turn your back to them with all these regulatory going back and forth between the U.S. and China. I'm hoping that it's all going to work out and that we can kind of settle these things and these companies can move forward. But I don't see any of the big tech companies pulling out and saying we're done with China. It's just too big of a market.
Dan, looking to some of your other themes that you're watching, one of the through lines is what's going to happen with enterprise spending this year and where that IT spending is going to be deployed. So we talked about the AI piece, but I know you're focused on a couple of other themes, including software and infrastructure as a service. Are we going to see moderation or acceleration in some of those areas?
Well, Julie, if you look at the recent studies that have come out on IT budgets for this year, we're projecting about 8% growth. You mentioned enterprise software, the companies like SAP and Salesforce, Adobe, Autodesk, all these household names. That's been an area where growth was pretty muted last year. A lot of large contracts, didn't go through. CIOs were nervous about the economy. We're expecting that to grow about 13%. If you look at the data center space, which you just mentioned, infrastructure as a service, that's going to be AWS, Azure, GCP, Ali Cloud. That area is becoming much, much more mature. And if you guys can probably remember looking back at, let's say Amazon's or Microsoft's recent reports, these areas that were growing 40, 50%, for example, AWS, I think is growing at 16% right now, have really become much more mature. And I would expect that to continue, Julie, going forward. Data center was a super hot spot 5 years ago, but those growth rates are really starting to slow down. I don't really see a big change there. But hopefully for some revival a little bit into the enterprise software space. And then hopefully we can continue growing in terms of data center, but I don't think we're ever going to return back to the growth rates that we had previously, especially after COVID.
And Dan, to get you out of here on this, I want to get your views on the chip sector as well, Dan, as we head into 2024. Obviously, it's a big sector, a lot of verticals. Any specific verticals within the semis, Dan, that you'd be especially bullish on?
Well, Josh, you mentioned earlier the AI space. That's the hottest space right now. What's kind of funny is we had the big spike during COVID, work from home. So then all the chips companies who produce chips that went into laptops and PCs and smartphones did really well. And then it flipped when that cycle went down. And now we have that sector bouncing back strongly where industrial and auto, which was strong during COVID, is actually pulled back. But we saw the bottom, Josh, in the first quarter of 23 in the chip space. We've had 10 consecutive quarters of positive growth in overall sales. There's a lot of projections out there that go from anywhere from 15 to 20% growth in revenues in the semiconductor space. And again, I think the hottest space would have to be AI. We talked about those names before within the chip space. But we are seeing a revival in some of the mature markets like smartphones, PCs, and laptops, which is about a third of the total chip market.
All right, Dan, lots and lots to sift through and think about going into this year. Really appreciate all of it.
Thank you.